Salaneck. I am an infectious disease specialist at the University Hospital in Uppsala. I'm going to start out with a short presentation about the coronaviruses and the disease that they cause. Coronaviruses are a family or an order of viruses. There are numerous viruses. We have known of these since the 1960s. There are basically 4 groups or subgroups within the family. The SARS coronavirus 2, which is active at present, is a member of the beta, the second group of coronaviruses. The name coronavirus comes from Latin corona, which means crown, because of the microscopic appearance of the virus. I can show you on a picture here. It's the spike proteins that emanate from the lipid shell of the virus that gives the virus particle a crown-like appearance. Within the lipid shell there is an RNA genetic matter that conveys the genetic information. It's a relatively small RNA genome. Specifically, the coronaviruses are known to infect numerous mammals and birds. The bat, most often the fruit-eating bats, appear to have the largest variation of their coronaviruses, and most evidence points to bats as a source of, or an evolutionary source of most coronaviruses, including the SARS coronavirus 2. So this is a zoonotic disease, an infection that can pass from one species to another species, and in this case we believe that the SARS coronavirus 2 originated in bats and moved through a bridge host and then to humans. We know of at least 7 coronaviruses, of which 4 often cause infections yearly. Most of the time they give rise to very mild symptoms, and most of them are respiratory. In 2003, the first SARS coronavirus was reported and resulted in over 8,000 cases and 774 deaths, with a case mortality rate around 9.6%. There have been no known cases of this virus since 2004. In 2012, a second major coronavirus outbreak emanated from the Arabian Peninsula in 2012. This virus was named MERS coronavirus, MERS for Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. This differs very greatly from the SARS virus in that it has basically caused small outbreaks, mainly in hospital environments. The contagiousness of the MERS coronavirus is also much lower than SARS-1. And has only, so far, since 2012, caused about 2,500 cases and 850 mortalities, which gives a mortality rate of about 35%. So the contagiousness is less, but the mortality rate is higher. And then, of course, in 2019, the SARS coronavirus 2, which leads to the disease COVID19, was identified. The track is that on the 31st of December 2019, the World Health Organization was reported from China a viral outbreak of viral pneumonia with an unknown cause in the city of Wuhan in central China in the Hubei province. Early on in the outbreak, it was suspected that this disease was passed from animals to people from a wet market in central Wuhan. On the 8th of January, about a week later, it was identified that these patients had a coronavirus, and this was then later named SARS coronavirus 2. Transmission continued in the Hubei province, where Wuhan is the central city, and then to further regions on the Chinese mainland. The following weeks, several cases were exported from China to mainly close-lying countries in Eastern Asia. On the 31st of January, the first case was reported from Sweden in the city of Jönköping, which was imported from Wuhan. This was isolated effectively and no follow-up cases were reported. On the 11th of March, the World Health Organization classed the COVID-19 outbreak as a pandemic. At the same time, at least 500 laboratory cases were identified in Sweden, 1 death in Stockholm, and several cases in the west of Sweden and in the south of Sweden. And this has continued to today, where we have above 1,200 cases in Sweden and 10 deaths. The COVID-19 disease can vary greatly symptomatically. It can be between mild respiratory symptoms with or without a fever, all the way to critical disease with respiratory failure and multi-organ failure. The World Health Organization performed an examination of the first 55,000 cases in the Hubei province recently. The results showed that 80% of the patients had a very mild disease, while around 14% had a serious disease with shortness of breath, an increased frequency of breathing, and desaturation. That is, that the lungs were unable to provide enough oxygen to the bloodstream. About 6% of the patients were critical, that is, that they needed intensive care. Also from this investigation, it appeared very clear that those patients that progress to a more serious level of disease do so within 5 to 7 days, and that the most serious forms of respiratory failure within 8 days. A specific appearance on CT scans has been identified and called ground glass. So a radiological examination can also be give guidelines for diagnosis. Otherwise, polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, is used to identify the virus particles either from the nasopharynx, which is in the back of the nose, from the throat, or from sputum, that is secretion from the lower respiratory tract. You know, we also know that the virus is excreted through feces, that is through excrement, where it's at present unclear of the relevance for transmission. Symptoms are mainly fever. 99% of the patients have fever. Then malaise and tiredness, dry cough, anorexia, muscle pain, shortness of breath, often within 1 week, and also a productive cough, that is congestive cough in English. There are specific radiological signs of the coronavirus 19. On a regular chest X-ray, diffuse infiltrates can be seen on both lungs at several positions, which differs greatly from the picture from a bacterial pneumonia. A computer tomography also shows this specific ground glass appearance, often bilaterally in both lungs. According to the World Health Organization, and the investigation in China have led to the conclusions that age is a risk for contracting a serious disease, and that is above 60 years of age. Also, underlying conditions such as high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic lung disease and cancer are also risks for contracting a more serious form of the disease. It appears that droplets are the main route of transmission for the SARS coronavirus 2. But fomites are an important route of transmission as well, and that is mainly objects that have been contaminated through droplets from a sick patient that can be touched by another person and then transferred into the airways. It is not known what role aerosols, that is very small droplets that can remain in the air for a longer period of time, what kind of role they play in transmission. A term called Arnaud is often used in epidemiological work. The Arnaud factor describes the average contagiousness of a contagion. If one person contaminates or infects one other person, in average, that gives an Arnaud of 1. If one patient, on average, infects 2 people, that results in an Arnaud of 2. As long as Arnaud is above 1, there will be a spread of the disease. When it's below 1, the disease will eventually die out. The Arnaud that's been calculated for COVID19 or SARS coronavirus 2 is somewhere between 2 and 3, but higher numbers have been calculated in certain parts of the outbreak. At present, the mortality or case fatality rate is between 1 and 5%, depending on many factors. And we have seen that different healthcare organizations have been able to contain the disease more effectively in some situations. In areas where there have been a large amount of people in the healthcare system needing care, case fatality rates have crept up to about 5%. We also know that in the age category of 80 and above, the fatality rate is around 20%. The incubation period is longer than for other viral diseases, up to 14 days, but the median is between 4 and 6 days. I'll end by talking about a few practical measures or factors that we have to work with in a healthcare situation, since that's what I'm here to talk about. At present, we protect ourselves in the healthcare situation by using protective equipment, and this is something I'm sure that everyone has seen on television and in pictures and other media. There are differing opinions about what kind of protection wear should be used in a healthcare setting. But at present we use a system that looks like this, where we protect our working clothes with a gown. We use gloves. We protect the airway with a breathing filter that filters particles, and some kind of shield that protects the face, mainly the eyes. In some situations we rely on different kinds of breathing protection, depending on whether we define the risk for droplet or aerosol transmission to be high or low. This outbreak has put many healthcare systems under great pressure, especially in those countries where the outbreak has preceded the outbreak in Sweden. Some of the measures that we've taken at the clinics around the country in Sweden is to increase testing of patients. And in many of the major hospitals, special facilities for taking samples from the patients have been established. And in Uppsala we have used an emergency tent to be able to test or sample the patients at a higher degree than we could indoors by using these facilities. Today we can take samples from between 40 and 50 patients every day by using these facilities. Inside the tent, it's quite rudimentary, but we have a possibility of separating the patient from other material, and we also have a possibility of cleaning up with a sink, so we can wash both hands and equipment that's been used. And here we see some of our one of our nurses prepared for taking samples. The same procedures are used indoors where we have to admit patients to the clinic. So those are a few words about the virus and the condition that it causes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we go on to Karin.
Okay, thank you for having me here. My name is Karin Tegmark-Wisell and I'm a medical doctor and I work at the Public Health Agency of Sweden. So we've just heard from Erik most of the background information regarding this infection, and I will try to give you a short update. What is the situation today? And I have a focus on Sweden. So we just heard that the epidemic, that is now a pandemic, that is, it is spread all over the world, and it is not only spread all over the world, but there's also in several continents communicable spread within the society. So you don't know in particular who is having the disease. So you need to be aware of that. You can have the disease from basically anyone in society. And of course this differs, but it's important for everyone to realize that it's not only the ones coming from Italy or China, which was the situation a few weeks back, but now we have spread within the society, and everyone needs to take action based on that. At present, in Europe, we have about 85,000 cases, and of those, more than 4,000 dead cases. So this is a disease that has really some challenges, because like we just heard, it goes from having really, really mild symptoms and to cause death. And that is a challenge because, I mean, the good news is that you can have the disease, and like Erik was saying, most people that get the disease, they don't get very ill at all. They might have a cold or a flu-like situation for 1 or 2 weeks, and then they will resolve and get better. But enough people get a really, really severe disease and need hospitalization, and in the worst case scenario, some will even die. And Erik was saying that most of the cases have fever, and that's what is said in all the reports. But we also need to be aware of that the reports are mainly, at this stage anyway, they are written based on the cases that are being diagnosed. So probably, I don't know if you agree with me, there are cases that don't have fever, because we know that. Yes. So some cases can only have like a mild cold, and that is really challenging because you don't realize that you're carrying a disease that could for other people be really, really dangerous. But I will come back to different things that you need to do and adhere to. So coming back, 85,000 cases in Europe and more than 4,000 dead in Europe. When it comes to Sweden, the situation today, we have more than 1,400 cases, and there are, as has been mentioned, 10 deaths. In total, we've had 35 patients in the intensive care unit, and this number is important to follow because it will be a huge stress on the hospitals and not the least the intensive care units. When we look at the epidemic in Sweden, when it started, we had our focus on risk areas, so we were looking a lot on travelers coming back from Wuhan or the Hubei province, and then later on the risk area was increased to all of China, and it was increased to South Korea, and then Iran, and then Italy. But quite soon after the disease started to spread in Europe, it sort of lost the possibility to be limited to certain areas. Because that is also really the challenge, because the cases we see, they are more or less the tip of the iceberg. So we need to be aware of that there are more cases than the ones we see and the ones we measure. And sometimes when there's lots of mild cases, we have the problem with an epidemic that is spreading in the silence. So you don't see the cases. It's not like people come and to the hospitals and you know that they have coronavirus, because it can spread in the silence. And we all in Europe had focus on the countries that we knew had the disease, but we were not really expecting that it would spread so fast in Europe with the travel that we have within Europe, and also that we would not realize when the cases were starting to come in. We will later, most likely, by genetics and by some other methods, have more of an understanding how the spread has occurred and how much of the cases that are sort of below the surface, if you look at the tip of an iceberg. But there are also reasons to believe that there were a spread in China even before when they started to talk about it in January. That's when they realized what they had. But most likely the spread had started earlier. When it comes to Sweden, we of course found the cases because we were looking for Italians, we were looking for people coming from Iran. So in the beginning there were travelers. But now it has turned to be more people from society. And that's why we also have really strongly advocated that we need to realize that we now have a pandemic and we have a spread in society in Sweden. We try to follow by different systems from the Public Health Agency of Sweden how the disease is spreading. One is the numbers that are being diagnosed at hospitals. But then we also have a sentinel system. That is a system that consists of about 70 physicians that work out on different small officers like general practitioners. And they sample throughout the season all patients that come to see them that has flu-like symptoms. And we started to check for COVID-19 in this flu-like system in week 9. Week 9 was the large holiday, the sport holiday in Sweden, where we had a lot of import. So when we look in week 9, we could see no cases of this coronavirus disease, but then they started to come in the sentinel system week 10, and we have seen more of them in week 11. But this is just, this is not all of the cases, but it's some sort of signal on how well it is spreading in society. So that is one way to measure, and to measure by diagnostics. But then we're also looking at syndrome surveillance. So we have various types of ways of measuring. We can look how people are seeking for different symptoms that they have. And of course now a lot of people are seeking for symptoms even though they don't have it. But we can look at the activities on internet to understand also how the disease is spreading. And then we can also have various mobile telephone apps. So we have a system where we collect the data, the health status of various people. So we also collect that and try to have to look for COVID-19 in those systems. But we need to develop more systems, and we need to find out how to sample in a good way to find how the disease is spreading in society. It has been spoken a lot about the risk of hospitals being overwhelmed by the situation. And that is why all people need to take action, because you don't know if you are the carrier of the disease to someone that might need hospitals later. Some people think, well, it doesn't really matter, I'm young, I'm not a risk group. Well, sure, yes, but you need to be aware of that you can be the one that spreads the disease faster than we would if we all try to limit the spread. So that's why we, since about 10 days back, have really advocated that if you have symptoms of some sort of infection, even though it is mild, you should stay at home and you should limit your social contacts. And you should be aware of that this disease is spreading mainly through contacts. So if we limit contacts when we get sick, that will be a very, very large thing to stop the disease from spreading fast. Because if it spreads fast, then the hospitals where like Erik works will be overwhelmed, and it will be hard to take care of all the patients. Yeah, so I will stop there.
Thank you very much. And please continue.
Okay, so I'm Niels Gottfried. I'm a professor of economics in Uppsala, and I'm a macroeconomist, so I'm not don't know about the health issues, but I will talk about the macroeconomic problem and how the politicians are trying to deal with this economic problem, what I see as the main economic problem that we have in Sweden and elsewhere. But I will focus on Sweden. So if you talk about the economic implications, you have to start to say what time perspective do we have? And we don't know how long this will last. As I understand, it will take at least a year to get a vaccine. We could hope that there will be some kind of treatment that will be working reasonably, or maybe that you get some very quick tests so we can basically test the whole population and then get control over it. I don't know. It would be interesting to hear from you later what you think about this. But as economists, those of you who have studied economics, you know when we don't know, we usually make an assumption. So I will assume that this will be over in 6 to 12 months. Then if we look at the long-run implications, then it seems that this should not have much effect on the economy, because we know that most of the people who will die from this are going to be old people who are not part of the labor force. So that would suggest that, yeah, it's going to be bad, and then we're going to be back to normal. But there's one thing that is a problem here that can create long, or not very long-term, but persistent effects. And that is if companies are killed by this what is happening now. If a lot of companies go bankrupt, then this will have persistent effects on the economy. And I see this as the main economic problem that we face, that we may lose a lot of companies. And the main problem for the politicians is to try to prevent that from happening. So the big problem, as I said, is that you have a lot of companies that see their demand collapse to zero, or very, very much. They lose all their demand, or they are unable to produce because they cannot get their inputs. And this is not all firms, of course not, but it's a lot of firms, and they are spread all over the economy. We have, for example, the service sectors, where people come together. That's where you don't want to be now, in restaurants, theaters. People don't want to travel. All kinds of service sectors are very badly hit, shops. But also, for example, firms that are delivering parts to the car industry and so on. And what is unique here is that you have a collapse of demand which is astronomical compared to what we normally see. I mean, normally in the financial crisis, production decreased by 5% or something like that. Of course, there were some firms, hit more than that, but still, this is, for those firms, it's a very large shock. And that means that, and in this, you cannot solve this by just doing special things in special sectors. You need some kind of very broad measures to handle this problem, in addition to special actions. Now, then the Riksbank is lending money to the banks so they can lend money to the companies. But that doesn't solve the whole problem. Far from it. Because the companies have to be solvent. So if you are a company, you have assets and you have debt. And the difference between assets and debts is called your own capital, or your equity. And in order to operate a business, you need to have a positive equity. You have to have more assets than debt. If your debt is bigger than your assets, then by law you have to close down the company because you're bankrupt. And if you now see your income going to zero, you still have a lot of costs, you're going to eat up that that equity very quickly, and the company will be bankrupt, and nobody wants to lend to you, and besides, even you're not even allowed to continue the operation. This is the big problem that may happen to many companies. So basically what you need to save those companies is to lift off the costs very quickly. Now, for most firms, the major part of costs is inputs and wages. And capital costs are, for most firms, a relatively small part of the costs. And inputs, you can stop buying the inputs if you don't produce anything. So it's all about the wages. That's the biggest cost for many, or a very large part of the cost for most firms. And basically, what you need is to lift off the wage costs very, very quickly. Otherwise, these firms will be bankrupt, and then loans will not help them. So if you follow normal procedures in Sweden, you want to lay off workers, by law you have to tell them a month or 2 months or 4 months earlier, depending on how long that worker has been employed. And also, so that's one, the normal procedures doesn't really work in this situation. And also, a lot of people will be really badly hurt if you had these mass layoffs. And also, if mass layoffs will mean that firms lose a lot of workers, if you lay off workers, then maybe they go and get another job, and then the company will have trouble restarting because they lost key people. So the idea of just laying off people doesn't, that would create a lot of problems and kill a lot of firms. So the solution then is that the government goes in there and pays the wages. And this Monday, the Swedish government had a press conference where they announced 3 main things. So one is called korttidspermittering, short time, I'm not sure how to call it, short time layoff, something like that. And that is something that they copied from Germany. Germany used this in the financial crisis, and they had been working on this, and now they pulled it out of the drawer and adjusted it, and they scaled it up. So firms can now reduce working time by 20, 40 or 60%, and the government pays much of the wage for the time when you're off, so the employee does not lose so much. And if the company reduces working time by 60%, then the wage cost of that worker is reduced to roughly half of what it was before. And so that's one thing that the government is doing, which I think is good. Secondly, they offer credit to firms by saying that you can wait, you don't with your tax payment. So you can postpone your tax payment, and that's effectively a loan to the firm. Again, as I said, that will not help the firm to become solvent, but it may solve the so-called liquidity problem, that you have cash on hand. And then another action is that the government is paying the sick pay for April and May. So these are good actions, I think, and very strong actions. But I see one problem here, and that is that these actions will not solve the problem for the firm that has totally lost its demand. Because if you have no income, then it will be very hard to pay half the wage cost that you normally have for very long. So you will very soon run out of money. But so I'm sure they are working on this problem at the government. Okay, so let me end by talking about some things that I think will not really, are not that important or even negative. A lot of politicians are declaring state of emergency and war and whatnot. Well, the Riksbank is reducing the interest rate, or all central banks, and they're buying bonds. I don't know, maybe it cools down the financial markets, but it's clearly not solving the problems for these firms that I just described. So I'm not saying it's bad, but it's not addressing the main problem. Also, throwing out money in general, like reducing some tax or handing out money to people, is not going to solve any problem. It's just going to make the government finances worse. You have to have directed action here. Another thing is this idea of closing the borders. For me as an economist, it seems really crazy to do that in a general way. When you have this infection on both sides of the border, what's the point of closing the border? I mean, you can tell people to travel less, so you spread the disease less. You can tell people, you can close the border to prevent people coming from very heavily infected areas. That makes sense. But I don't see the point of closing the border between Norway and Sweden. What's the problem when you pass the border between Norway and Sweden? I mean, why is it worse to travel from Gothenburg to Oslo than to travel from Gothenburg to Sundsvall? I really can't see that. And we have to remember that today our production systems are highly integrated. Their goods and services are passing the borders, going around, back and forth. Think of all the things that go into a Volvo. And it's just not possible to produce if you close the borders. And you need not only goods to travel, you also need people to travel. You need people to travel, service machines, you need consultants, experts, and so on. I mean, we have to remember Ericsson is today classified as a service company. They provide services. For services you need people. You can't do everything on the internet. So I think this closing of borders can have very big costs, and it will be interesting. It would be interesting to hear from you whether you think it serves any purpose in terms of reducing infections. I suspect it has relatively small marginal effects. I think this is a bit like when Trump he started to call this the China virus. The idea is you want to say, oh, I'm protecting my people and it's someone else's fault. That's what the politicians are trying to signal by closing the borders. Let me end with a philosophical thing. We have to realize when we, in life and when we organize society, that everything that happens is unexpected. If you drive on a road in the middle of nowhere, and there is no traffic there, and then you cross another road and there's a car coming on the other road, that was unexpected. I mean, what was the probability that there would come a car on the other road? It was very small, but it happened. I mean, you always have these unexpected things happening, like the financial crisis 10 years ago, and we have to design the economy, the economic policy and the social system so that we can handle these unexpected events. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we go into the Q&As for tonight, I would like to give you the opportunity if you want to ask questions to each other, because I saw you were listening very carefully, or if you want to comment on each other's presentations.
We could start with the border issue.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you. I mean, closing the borders could at some point be a reason to do that, and it could be effective. But it needs to be done at certain moments. So what we did when we realized that the situation in Iran was out of control was that we more or less closed, we didn't close the border for Iranians, but we closed the flights coming from Iran, because we know it was an area where they themselves did not have control. So we would expect people coming from Iran with the disease. But as you're saying, the situation as it is now, one could imagine if people would come to Sweden for healthcare, if the situation is really bad in some other countries and there are no spots in the intensive care units, etc.
Okay.
So it would be of a very selfish reason that we will not be solidaric with others. And what we've noticed since Norway closed the kindergartens and the schools, they were off for holidays all of a sudden. So they have now traveled to all the Swedish ski resorts, because the ski resorts are closed in Norway as well. So they are coming to our ski resorts, and it's a heavy burden because people not only get coronavirus maybe in the ski resort, we will see, but they break their legs and things happen there. So they are now having huge pressure on the various physicians that are in the ski resorts, because the Alps are closed, Norways are closed. So that is a little bit of an issue. So we are thinking, oh, maybe we should close the border to Norway, but we haven't gone there. But we need to think about what will the effect be on our ski resorts, because we know from Italy and Austria that the disease could spread, and we don't know exactly where it spread, but we have some ideas because we know some situations, and there are certain things going on in ski resorts, like going in those gondolas where you stand very, very close to each other. So we are now giving recommendations to the Swedish ski resorts, but being out in the slopes is no problem. But after skis, and if you're in a pub and very crowded and so on, that is a risk scenario. So we didn't expect the Norwegians to when they were told not to go to school and limit their social interactions, then they went to Sweden, of course. So that was kind of a surprise. But in general, there's very little effect of closing the borders, and especially if you have the same epidemic situation in the countries.
I agree. That's, I think, also I find a measure that is more used for a politician to show strength and determination than will actually resolve the situation. And especially at present, when we know that there is an equal burden on both sides, the focus should be put on things like social distancing and preventing the transmission between people. Closing a border is just not an effective measure.
Right.
What about the time perspective? Do you have any idea? Are we talking about 6 months or 12 months or 3 months? Or
the time's up now, isn't it?
That's a difficult question. But we don't really know why it stopped in China, to be honest. Of course, the social distancing was very important. But we haven't yet seen any good data showing what proportion of the population in China was really infected. Because also with an infection, you probably heard the term herd immunity, that when you have enough people in a country or a society that has had the infection, and I think you mentioned that we expect there to be some immunity after you have had the infection. So if enough people have immunity, then they can protect the weak ones. So it could be so that it resolved in China after about 3 months due to the combination of social distancing, but also that the population has actually had the infection in such a large amount that it was no longer possible for the infection to spread vividly, because you need to find unprotected individuals to be able to spread rapidly. So when you reach a certain threshold of people that are immune, then it will be more difficult for the disease to spread. So we will see what happens in Italy, but the good scenario is that everyone is now taking social distancing, so we try to limit the spread, and maybe 2 to 3 months for now, most likely it will come back, but we don't know. We have to be humble.
All right, maybe directly relating to that, we have a question for you, Karin, related, which is what patients are tested in Sweden. I think you went into that a bit before, but then also why there are not more resources put into testing.
That is a quite complex question and issue. So there are several reasons why we are recommending testing as it looks today. So when we didn't have a pandemic, we knew that there was an epidemic in certain countries, then we could focus our resources on testing all the people that had some kind of symptoms that could present as the coronavirus disease. And then we tested all the travelers coming back from various countries. But then we had this Sentinel system, and we also had some other systems that we had information that we are not finding the right people, because people are coming through this net when we were testing the Iranians, the Chinese, etc., or the Swedes having been abroad coming back. So then we needed to have other systems, and what is the most important is to protect the healthcare, because if you get the disease into the healthcare, then it will severely affect the ability of the healthcare system, and you need to protect the healthcare workers. So in a situation where we don't want people to travel to testing centers, we don't want people to come to hospitals to be tested, because then you need to use your protective equipment for the testing. And we don't either want the resources to be used up for healthy individuals that are at home. And another thing is that when you take your test, you need to travel somewhere, as I mentioned, to do the testing in general, and then it takes at the best 6 to 8 hours, but there's a lot of administration and you need to wait mostly for a day almost. And we don't want people either to travel away, and we don't want them to take precautions when they have the test, so we want them to take precaution immediately and stop the social distancing. And also, when you do the testing, you have to be aware of that if you do the testing before you get symptoms, a negative result is not valid. And if you do the testing too late, it's not important anymore. And the type of testing you do need to have a high precision, because if you get the result that you are negative and it turns out that you were positive, then you will do more harm than not. So you need to have high quality. And the laboratories throughout Sweden has really leveraged up and have a good capacity, and it is increasing all the time, but there is limited resources. And in February, March, a lot of the population are having a small cold. Almost 20 to 30% are experiencing some runny nose. So if we would test that many people, then there's a risk that we would limit the resources for the healthcare. And also there's a risk that we would have a delayed response when you're waiting for your test result. And you need to have healthcare professionals to decide if it is valid to do the testing when you're doing it. But we're looking at scaling up even more. But it's not only the resources, especially not the resources at the laboratories. It's also the resources who are going to do the testing, because we don't want to use up those resources. But we are doing some studies to look how is self-sampling, how valid is that. So we've done quite a lot of self-samplings on individuals, and it seems that it works very well. And then we would limit anyway the risk of using the resources from the healthcare sectors for the ones that are being healthy in the society. So hopefully we can find algorithms where you can test people without stressing the healthcare system. But we're not quite there yet. But also you need to be aware of the test is not stopping the transmission. The test is not making you being well. So if you take action when you have symptoms and you do social distancing, then we would have the effect. So yes, sure, it's good to know how the situation looks in the country, but the test is not going to make you healthy. So be aware of your symptoms and take action from that.
All right, maybe also related to that question, we have another one that's for you, Erik, and that is how the situation is in the hospital right now. If you have everything you need, or if there's any shortage of any utensils.
Yes, that's we are preparing ourselves for an increased number of patients, and we already are under a certain amount of stress, and that is right now primarily because of the sampling and the testing of the patients that has caused the use of a lot of material, has caused the use of a lot of personnel as well. We have that under control right now because we have created a system that has made this much more effective. But we already have a number of patients in the ward that are not severely ill but are still in the need of health care, and that also puts a stress on the personnel working with them. It creates a larger need for disposable materials. And we also see that we're beginning to get our first intensive care unit cases now. We only have 2 in Uppsala at the time being, but we also know that the need for intensive care arises about a week after, or between 1 and 2 weeks after the debut of symptoms. So unfortunately we are expecting a rise in the need for intensive care during the next week. And this will put great pressure onto the hospital, because the intensive care units, they use a lot of resources for each patient. And we also know that the patients need lengthy intensive care. They need to be in the ICU for some extended periods of time. Some other conditions, maybe you only need to be stabilized in the ICU for a day or 2, and that's not the case here. So once you admit a patient, you have to be prepared that the patient's going to be there for some time. We've tried to use creative solutions to solve our problems with the disposables, and we're trying to use as many items as possible that can be reused. We're using breathing filters that are with switchable filters, so we can disinfect them and use them again many times. And we were trying to use face protection that also can be used several times by just being disinfected, and that means not having to rely on the disposables. I think that's something that people should look into more, how to become uncoupled to this need for supply, because of the delivery problems from other countries. It is hard to refill our supply lines with breathing filters, with gloves and masks and other materials for healthcare. And another important aspect is, even if we have a limited amount of these things that are directly connected to care of COVID patients, other materials are also not being resupplied in the way they should for performing operations or other healthcare procedures.
And that is because of the issues that the other European countries are facing, or why is there lack of supply?
I think in part it's because of the international market. Many products are produced in Italy, in China, and in Germany, where there are export restrictions now. Either induced restrictions or natural restrictions, because of just the factories aren't working the way they're supposed to. And also the demand for these products has been increased as well, with the increased number of patients, the increased number of samplings of patients. We use an enormous amount more than what we usually do. So it's both the supply and the demand have put stress on the system.
Yeah. Maybe related to that, for you, Niels, the question. So the question is, what industries, which countries, and specifically are specifically vulnerable in a recession caused by this pandemic, or what your opinion on that is, I suppose? It's quite a broad question. I just realized what I was reading. I'm sorry.
Quite broadly, but as I said, the service sectors, or where you interact, people interact. That's where people don't want to go. So they are obviously hit directly. I mean, restaurants and theaters and so on, culture events. But if they keep closing borders, then it will be a lot of difficulties also for manufacturing and so on.
Maybe since we're just talking to you anyway, I'm just going to stick with the second question for you that was also here. So it's been stated before that in the financial crisis, Sweden had the advantage of being not part of the Eurozone, and we have a question that's, well, asking if it's an advantage at this point as well, which is, I guess, also related to closing the borders and the whole idea of sovereignty, and, well, if it's an advantage for Sweden kind of to be an outlier right now in that system.
Well, in general, I think it's good to be out of the Eurozone because you have your own monetary policy. But I don't know, I don't think there's anything specific here. I think all countries are similarly hit by this, so I don't think it makes a big difference here in this case.
Yeah, it's not about the currency anymore, it's more about the working together.
Yeah.
So then to go back a bit more to the medical side again, and I guess it's for you, Eric, but I'm guessing you can also answer, Karin. So if I would have symptoms of COVID-19, what should I do? I mean, I think we all know the number that we're supposed to call, but the person that asked is also asking how to cure myself, or what can I do to kind of make myself not be taken to the intensive care unit, I guess, and how do I avoid infecting others?
Well, first of all, as we talked about earlier, there are a number of risk factors that we cannot affect. That is, what diseases, other diseases we have, like diabetes, high blood pressure, lung diseases, and also, unfortunately, age, which is I would very much like to be able to affect, but that seems to be a one-way trip. First of all, what also should be stated here is that one of the big problems with this outbreak is the lack of treatment and the lack of prophylaxis. We don't have a vaccine, and there is no treatment, we're working on some treatment. We're working on some treatments. I'm not specifically myself doing that, but people are working on treatments, and there are some promising studies, but basically there's no standard treatment to apply to this, like you could with a bacterial infection. So what could you do to? So first of all, what you can do is protect yourself. So you do not acquire the disease, and that's the things that we've been talking about here, like social distancing and very good hand hygiene. People should go out and do things. They should be able to meet people, maybe do it outside, and you have to go buy food. You should continue to buy food. That's a good idea, to eat and drink. But try to go to the store when maybe not everybody else is there. And try to keep your distance from other people without appearing too paranoid. And then when you get home, make sure to wash your hands properly, so that whatever you have touched when you've been out doing your errands, that you get rid of the dirt from your hands, and then use hand disinfection. That will lower the risk of acquiring the disease. And then staying away from large social gatherings as well, because you do not know who has what in a large social gathering. So unfortunately, that's something that we have to avoid during the next period of time, which is a real bummer, because that's the way it is, and that's how you can protect yourself. If you get sick, we really don't have any specific advice for COVID-19. Hydrate, eat properly is probably the best thing that you can do. And also, the recommendation is to prevent spread of the disease. If you have symptoms, do not go out. Stay away from going to school, stay away from going to work, and call for advice before you actually go to a physician's office or to the hospital, because often you can get good advice from a telephone call. And there are trained nurses that usually sit on the other side of the phone, and they'll give you good advice if you have to go to a doctor, where you should go. So you limit the amount of contacts in the healthcare system, so you go to the right place right away and at the right time as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just to add to that is that if you're not feeling too bad, you're just having a cold, then don't call 1177, because it needs to be open for the ones that are really having a severe condition, whether it is a heart attack or if it is high fever and maybe COVID-19. So stay at home and try to cure yourself by just being sleep a lot and drink and eat and live a healthy life as you can.
And there is an alternative phone line as well that you can call.
Yeah. So it is 11. Oh, now I can't remember it. 114, right? 113. And there's also a web page.
Yes.
Crisis information.
So there are channels to if you have general concerns about this or questions to ask, then there is another telephone number to call. so that the sick people can get to 1177. I use that in English.
So that also relates perfectly to the next question, which would be directed for you. So I think a lot of people are wondering, me personally as well, what motivates Sweden's different approach to this and why it's treated so differently here, because there are a lot of cases compared to the population, and I can hear from what you guys are saying that you do believe in social distancing, but you also believe in leaving it quite open and not actually forbidding it, but making people make the choice. So I think a lot of foreigners, seeing what happens in their own countries, are just wondering why that is the way to go in this situation.
So to start with, I think a lot of the things we do the same as other countries, but we do differ in some ways. And when you compare to other European countries, we have quite similar culture. So with them, we have more in common. But when you compare to a totalitarian state like China, we cannot force people to go into quarantine. And we cannot simply do those integrating, where you go into people's life and force them to do things. We have the Communicable Disease Act, so we can in fact tell people that you need to stay in your house. But there are certain rights also for a sick person. So we need to sort of look at the sick person's rights and the societal right and try to meet them in the best ways. But if there would be a person that would be very contagious and we knew she had the disease and she didn't take the actions that are told, then we can actually have the police come and take that person and put it in an infectious disease clinic or somewhere. But we believe that the best way for the society to act is if they all know how to protect themselves and how to protect others, and not use forces like they were able to do in China. Because even in China they didn't find all the cases. Then you will hide away when you're having an elevated temperature, for instance. And then there are some differences, and that is closing the borders, for instance, where some countries have the politicians mainly try to show their really the muscles that they're doing action. And then there is this school issue that is being discussed a lot. And if you close schools, that will also have effects. People that are in late stage of university, for instance, they're just about to get their degree, then it's unfortunate to close the schools. But as you know of today, schools are not being closed, not universities and gymnasium, but they are being moved out of the ordinary schooling, the houses. So that is one good way to do it and try to affect as little as possible. And I think that is what we're trying to do, to have the effects that we hope will make a difference, but try not to hurt society, to try to find a balance. And the big issue is now when it comes to play or kindergarten and elementary school. And since we know that children are not the vulnerable in this epidemic or the pandemic, it is of course very unfortunate if they get the disease, but they are not the ones that are going to be in hospitals and so on. So if we limit social interactions and we protect the elderly, of course there's also some people that are younger that unfortunately will end up in hospital, but we really need to protect the elderly. Those are the ones that is important, that they stay away from crowded situations and stay away from indoors and stay away where they risk to have the transmission. Children is not the problem. They can also spread the disease, but we have had no reports of children being massive in spreading the disease. We know that if you have very close contact, you can even spread the disease before you have symptoms. But what is really pushing the epidemic, we have yet no signs that it is the children. But more importantly, the children don't get so ill. So they are not the risk group here. But the problem is also when the children are at home, someone needs to be at home to take care of them, and then society will completely collapse. A lot of people that work in hospitals, they have small children, and they need to work for the society. So we believe that if you are strict and adhere to really making sure that you take care of the vulnerable and try to protect them, that will have a long reach.
So thank you. Before we move on to the last question, I just want to get your opinion on this, since we just talked about it. So you don't think in the near future there will be stricter measures on going outside in Sweden like other countries are performing it right now? Because
Not from the knowledge that we have today, but there are schools that has been temporarily closed. Like there was a school in Hudiksvall where they have no reports of cases in society. And then there was a person in that school who had traveled and caught the disease somewhere else and came back to school and unfortunately were in school for about a week having mild symptoms. And then it was a big exposure to the school. Then it was decided to close the school because it would have a big effect on that society.
But not just schools, but also like gyms, bars,
yes.
like everything that's still open right now compared
yes.
to other countries.
So if you take those social distancing rules and you adhere to strict hygiene rules, there's also, we have a guidance when it comes to meetings on our webpage, and that guidance can also be used for other activities as well, like gyms, etc. So you should try to consider to make sure that people can have social distancing. So some cinemas that are still open, they have closed every second row and they can close some of the seats to make sure that you can have social distancing. But now I guess they have no people coming to the cinema, so a lot of them are closing as well. So we are instead pushing what we know will have an effect. And that is social distancing. And even though we think that fomites might have a cause in this disease, it is actually not really proven that fomites are spreading the disease. Even though we know that the virus can survive for some time on surfaces. We also know that when there's very small limit of virus, and if it is dry in the air, it will die off quite quickly. But so we don't know for sure how important it is with the fomite spread, but we know very, very well that close contacts will spread the disease, and it will.
Fomite is when it's on.
Fomites, different particles.
No, it's on a surface.
Yeah.
So if Karin's computer is coughed on and that and she's infectious, then that becomes a fomite. And if I use her computer and then touch my face, that's the fomite transmission.
So we need to protect for that. I'm not saying anything else, but we don't know what role does it have in spreading this infection.
And I think maybe one thing that's from my perspective is that it's particularly important in a hospital, in a healthcare setting. Have you considered any recommendations about limiting, like in the cinemas that you were talking about, that actually having more official recommendations about the limitation of the number of people in a certain room at the same time, like in a store?
We have discussed that, but it's so conditional. So nothing that we have of now discussing to recommend. We are recommending that you adhere to certain rules, and especially when you have big meetings, but no, not yet.
So for now it's only recommendations, but there will not be rules.
No,
or like
but even if you have rules, you know, if we say that you're not allowed to have meetings, or we are recommending the government to take that decision, then people divide the meeting and say, okay, so we have 499. People try to find ways to go around, which is really disappointing.
Yeah. So it's about getting into people's heads.
And also when gymnasiums were switched to be on distance, then we see that there are big parties and people go traveling up skiing, and that's exactly what we don't want.
Yeah, but don't you think then you should have like laws or punish people for doing those things?
Yeah, one could have that, but then you would also need to take force from the police force to do those things. And do we believe that it will be so effective? So it is worth taking the police from doing other things. Yeah, maybe, but we haven't seen enough effects of it that we think it's worth risking other areas of society.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to have one last question that's for all of you, just to maybe a bit more hopeful as well, or more educational for all of us. So what do you think at this point already can be said about learning for the future? If there is another pandemic, for both the healthcare system, the Swedish state in general, and also the economic situation, what can be taken away from this situation? What could be improved next time?
Well, I think it's important, if you're adhering to social distancing and reading a good book, you should read Albert Camus, The Plague. And he starts off the book by saying that humanity has been affected by, I'm translating this from Swedish now, from both by war and the plague numerous times. And every time that the people are actually affected by war or the plague, they are equally unprepared. Preparedness is something that we have to learn, and this is something, our memory is sometimes far too short. We have to remember this, and I think we actually have to look at history as well. And we should look at history in all sorts of fashions when we design our social or our social structures, but we have to take into account that a pandemic will happen again. This is a zoonotic disease, it comes from animals, and we will have diseases that come from animals again. So this is not the last pandemic, it is one of many. So maybe this time we have to try to remember better what happened and be prepared for this to happen again, and have the structures that can be effectively instigated to stop the spread of a disease. And maybe that we should look at this in a more global fashion. How should we work together instead of different countries adapting different strategies to prevent spread?
Yes, I'm sure we will learn a lot, but it's also difficult to assess it when we're right in the middle. But lean is mean. I think you heard that a lot. If you have lean systems where you have just-in-time deliveries, we know that is a challenge when you have a pandemic, and all the countries are having a huge demand, like you were talking about before. We have a huge demand, and then the deliveries they're just in time. So it's I think we need to be more prepared in having more stocks when it comes to the healthcare, the least.
Yes, well, I just repeat what I said before, that if you look at the economy, things happen that you don't expect quite often. I mean, we had the financial crisis, before that we had the IT bubble, before that we had the oil crisis, and so on. Things like happen, and you have to, when you design the economic system, you have to think, have a robust, think about being able to handle shocks.